The blanket was spread, the food untouched. No one ever arrived. Welcome to Crimson Clues. I'm your host Antonio. Share your location in the comments. I love hearing where you're watching from. Your words bring this story to life. Let's begin. It is a truth universally unacknowledged, said Lord Peter Wimsey, delicately removing a crumb of Dundee cake from his lapel, that when an Englishman plans a picnic, the weather gods take it as a declaration of war. Miss Catherine Moorcroft, recently appointed secretary to the Reverend Dr. Strathmore of Lesser Whipple in Shropshire, laughed politely, not entirely sure whether Lord Peter was quoting Jane Austen, inventing his own gospel, or simply talking to himself. All three, she would later decide, might be correct. The occasion had been meant to be entirely innocent, indeed tediously so. The vicar's wife, an austere woman with a fondness for tweed and Teutonic punctuality, had arranged a modest parish outing to the edge of Gorse Hill Wood. Hamper-packed, hymn-sung, and timed with the unfailing tyranny of a train table, the affair had promised cucumber sandwiches, tepid lemonade, and possibly, though it was whispered only among the younger set, a flirtation or two among the gravestones. But by 2 o'clock the skies had turned bilious. The white canopy rented from Blandford and Sons, by royal appointment 1883, flapped madly in the wind, threatening to decapitate Mr. Willoughby, the choirmaster, who took this as divine judgment for having introduced syncopation into the psalms Wimsey had attended on a lark, or so he claimed, having arrived at the vicarage the previous afternoon in a 2-seater Lagonda, exuding equal parts charm and casual irreverence. Passing through, he'd explained, though it later emerged he had a standing invitation from the Marchioness of Catamole, whose family seat lay a scant 5 miles off, and whose son was under suspicion of embezzling funds from the Sanborn hunt. But as Wimsey himself once said, an English gentleman never explains his itinerary unless it involves train changes or gin. So it was that Lord Peter, armed with an umbrella that had once belonged to a Romanian spy and a flask of pre-war cognac, found himself beneath a dripping beech tree, in conversation with Miss Moorcroft, when the news arrived. It did not arrive dramatically. There were no screams, no wild-eyed messengers in mud-splattered boots. Instead it came via Mr. Pilcher, the churchwarden, who emerged from the direction of the vestry, with a face the colour of church linen, and a voice as uncertain as an Anglican doctrine. "There's been an incident, my lord." Wimsey cocked, his head like a spaniel that had heard something interesting in Latin. "In the church?" he asked. "No one's died during the anthem again, I trust? That happened once in Norfolk. Confused the entire liturgy." "No, sir," Pilcher stammered. "It's up on the bridle path where the vicar's wife was laying out the buns. We found someone, not from our party." "Dead?" said Wimsey quietly. Pilcher nodded. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the flapping of the disreputable canopy and the wheezing of Mrs. Tilling's pug, who suffered from what her veterinarian called nervous lungs. Wimsey stood, stretched, and gave his trousers a thoughtful flick. "Well," he murmured, "that does put the damper on the ginger beer. They found the body near a moss-choked stile that separated Gorse Hill Wood from the pasture beyond. The corpse, male, roughly 50, in a brown suit too warm for the season, lay sprawled against the gatepost with his hands curled upward in that oddly theatrical way corpses often adopt, as if they are caught mid-soliloquy. His hat, a crumpled trilby, was half submerged in a puddle, and there was a faint abrasion at the back of the skull. No picnic hamper was in evidence. It was Miss Felicia Ardsmore, the vicar's niece and noted village dramatist, who first suggested something sinister. "He doesn't look like he fell," she declared, peering down with an expression of rehearsed horror. "It's too symmetrical." "Some people are born symmetrical," Wimsey replied, squatting beside the body and observing the scene with idle precision. "Some achieve it through yoga, and some have it thrust upon them by blunt trauma. Yes, yes, very tidy. Too tidy, I'd say. Like a parlour rug laid just so to hide the ink stain. Detective Sergeant Havelock, a Shropshire man with the grim optimism of one who has seen too many tractor-related fatalities, arrived shortly thereafter and took control of the scene. He was tall, serious, and had a moustache that looked independently capable of field interrogations. "Looks like a fall," he said, after a cursory examination. "Could have slipped coming over the stile." "Quite," said Wimsey, still crouched, one monocled eye scanning the surrounding earth. "Except for the small problem that he's facing the wrong direction, has no mud on his knees, and is curiously free of leaf debris for someone who took a tumble in the underbrush." Havelock grunted. "And then," Wimsey added with an air of theatrical musing, "there's the fact that nobody here knows who he is." "No identification," Havelock confirmed, producing a wallet with nothing but a railway ticket and a £5 note folded with monastic care. "Not a local?" asked Miss Moorcroft, peering over the sergeant's shoulder. "Not unless he—" "Arrived in a very quiet manner," said Havelock. "Nobody saw him at the station, and nobody saw him walking up the path." "Well," said Wimsey, standing at last and brushing rain from his shoulders, "he's certainly made a quiet exit. As to his entrance, perhaps we ought to investigate what sort of man comes to a parish picnic uninvited, lies down among the brambles, and expires with such exquisite discretion." His eyes gleamed. "I rather think," he said, turning toward the vicarage. "This picnic may prove more exciting in its absence than it ever would have in its presence." And with that, the case of the picnic that never happened began, on wet ground in poor lighting and with a dead man no one admitted knowing. The parlour at the vicarage was far too warm for a May afternoon. A fire had been lit against the damp, as Mrs. Strathmore said with the sort of pious finality that left no room for reason or weather reports. Lord Peter Wimsey, installed on a horsehair sofa that emitted small protesting sighs under his frame, sipped tepid tea and considered. The wallpaper, a faded toil pattern populated by bucolic shepherdesses who gazed perpetually toward a fictitious stream. Mrs. Strathmore had thus far offered precisely 4 opinions: that the dead man was not one of us, that the picnic had been ruined, quite unnecessarily, that her niece Felicia was too fond of modern theatre, and that it would be a great mistake to cancel Evensong merely because of a corpse. Wimsey listened with affable detachment, nodding at the proper intervals and occasionally interjecting with a non-committal "quite so." His real attention was elsewhere, drawn to a curious absence. No one, not even the helpful Miss Moorcroft, had identified the man found near the stile, and no one could recall seeing him on the path, at the train station, or in the village pub. It was as though the fellow had materialized fully dressed and inconveniently dead on the vicar's doorstep. "Forgive me, Mrs. Strathmore," Wimsey said at last, setting down his cup with the kind of precision that would have made a bishop. "Nervous, but I'm curious. Was anyone absent from the picnic apart from the obvious?" "Absent?" She blinked. "You mean someone expected but not come?" "Yes. Or arrived late. Or perhaps went wandering off before the storm." She pursed her lips. "Well, young Timothy Braithwaite turned up after the hymn. Said his mother had kept him back to change. His trousers. Something about marmalade. And the Dean of Rexley sent word he was unwell. Gout, I believe. Beyond that," her brow furrowed. "Though now I think of it, Mr. Prewett did not stay long. You remember him? Tall man. Black hair. Keeps bees. I do love a man with bees," said Wimsey absently. "And did he leave with explanation or by stealth?" "Neither. Said something about a headache and departed just after the lemonade. Odd fellow." "Indeed," said Wimsey, standing. "And where might I find Mr. Prewett when not battling hymns or hornets?" Mrs. Strathmore considered. The old school. House just off the southern lane. Past the Smithsons' farm, you'll know it by the great deal of ivy and the smell of paraffin. Delightful. He bowed, and was halfway to the door when Miss Moorcroft caught him in the hallway with a bundle of damp maps and the expression of one who has remembered something useful at precisely the wrong time. "There's a boy," she said without preamble. "Schoolboy, name of Alec Weston, about 12, says he saw a man this morning. Said he wasn't from round here." Wimsey's interest sharpened. "Go on." "He was walking the Upper Ridge Trail. Alec was bird-watching, apparently, and he says he saw a man in a brown suit standing near the stone cairn, looking about in a peculiar way, as though he didn't quite expect the countryside to be there." Wimsey chuckled. "Like someone trying to find Oxford Street in a fog." "Exactly." Alec said the man had a map, or something, folded like one, kept checking it, then turning about as if looking for a landmark. Did he speak to the boy? No, but he looked startled when he noticed him, walked off sharpish down toward Haverley Cross. Wimsey's eyebrows lifted. "Haverley Cross? That's quite away from where we found our guest." 3 miles by foot, she nodded. "But the odd thing is, Haverley Cross is a ruined priory. There's nothing there now, no reason to go, unless you're keen on old stones or nettles." Wimsey made a low humming noise and turned the thought over as one might a coin found under curious circumstances. "Where's Alec now?" "With his aunt, Mrs. Worsley. She keeps the post office." "And the boy is unlikely to invent men in brown suits, I take it." "He's frightfully literal. Once wrote to the county council because the village sign didn't match the spelling on the rail timetable. Admirable. I should like to meet this truth-obsessed prodigy." They walked together toward the post office. The rain had dwindled to a petulant drizzle, the kind that paints the hedges silver but leaves the roads treacherous. The lanes were empty now, the villagers presumably gone to dry their socks and contemplate mortality in front of inadequate hearths. Inside the post office, young Alec sat at the counter with a copy of Birds of the British Isles and an air of earnest concentration. He looked up as they entered, blinked at Lord Peter, and then stood with schoolboy formality. "Afternoon, sir." "You must be Master Weston," said Wimsey. "I understand you've met a stranger." "Yes, sir." "Tell me everything, especially the parts you think are unimportant." Alec frowned. "Well, sir, it was just before 11. I'd gone out early to see if the redstarts were nesting near the cairn again. They weren't, but as I was coming down the ridge, I saw this man. He was on the lower path, near the stone post that marks the old coaching route." Wimsey nodded. Encouraging. He had a paper, looked like a map. But he wasn't reading it like an ordnance survey, more like he was trying to match something up. He turned round in circles twice. "Did he say anything?" "No, sir, but when he saw me, he stuffed the paper in his coat and started walking quickly downhill. I watched him until he turned into the lower wood. That's where the path forks. Toward Haverley Cross. Did you follow him?" Alec looked horrified. "No, sir, I wasn't sure he was his proper." Wimsey smiled. "A prudent instinct. And the man's description. Tall, middle-aged, bit of a paunch, brown suit, sort of city hat. He didn't look like anyone round here. He looked like London." Wimsey clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "My dear Weston, you shall grow up to be either a detective or an undersecretary, thank you." Back outside, Wimsey stood silently for a moment, considering the hill, the cairn, and the path winding through the trees. A man arrives in an unfashionable village, dressed for town and disoriented in the landscape, he said aloud. Carries a document he hides on being seen, heads toward an ancient ruin, is found dead. Some distance off with no map, no identity, and no apparent purpose. Miss Moorcroft adjusted her coat against the wind. "You think he found what he was looking for?" "If so," said Wimsey, "he paid for it in advance." He turned toward the southern lane. "Come, let's see if Mr. Prewett and his bees were as indifferent to the day's events as he claimed." and with that they disappeared into the damp green folds of the countryside, leaving behind a village already murmuring with theories, 3 damp picnic hampers, and a corpse no one had ever seen alive. The old schoolhouse stood in mild but deliberate opposition to its surroundings, where the rest of Lesser Whipple slouched with rural indifference, thatched roofs collapsing with polite regret, stone walls surrendering inch by inch to ivy. Mr. Prewet's abode seemed conscious of itself. The ivy here was manicured, the gate oiled, and the windows boasted curtains stiff enough to repel small birds. Wimsey and Miss Moorcroft arrived just as the hour hand crossed 2. The rain had ceased, but the clouds hung on in theatrical sulk, the sort that promised retribution. By dusk, bees murmured industriously around a squat wooden hive beside the kitchen garden, and a brass bell above the gate announced their arrival with a prim clang. Prewet himself answered the door with an expression that, on a more impolite face, might have passed for irritation. He was tall, spare, and wore a wool waistcoat the colour of old paste. His hair was black, slicked with precision, and parted with something approaching violence. "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said, as if it were a dare. "I am," said Wimsey, cheerfully. "And this is Miss Moorcroft. We come on behalf of the vicarage, bearing the unwholesome curiosity of those who have recently discovered a corpse." Prewet blinked. "I'm sorry." Wimsey tilted his head. "One is always a little disoriented after a parish picnic, especially when the highlight turns out to be a dead man in a brown suit. You did attend the festivities, I believe?" "For a time, yes. Only for a time. I left after the sandwiches. I had a headache." "Headaches are notoriously unsociable," said Wimsey, stepping neatly into the hall without waiting for invitation. "This is a charming house. You keep bees, I'm told." "I do." "How industrious of you." Prewet seemed torn between escorting his guest out with immediate effect and offering him honey. In the end, good manners or uncertainty won out, and he led them into a drawing-room faintly scented with linseed and lavender. The room was too clean, Wimsey thought. Not clean as in tidy, but as in defensive. There was no dust, no personal clutter. The books were alphabetical. Even the doilies looked deliberate. "I suppose you've heard about the body," said Miss Moorcroft, taking the armchair beside the fire. "Vaguely," said Prewet, pouring tea from a pot that had clearly not been intended for use that afternoon. "I passed the vicarage and saw a bit of a fuss. Felicia Ardsmore was gesticulating at a constable. But I didn't stop." "No interest?" Wimsey inquired. "None." "And yet the man died less than 100 yards from where you'd walked." "Earlier." Prewet's fingers tightened fractionally on the cup. "I was on the footpath, yes, but I saw no one, and I certainly didn't see a corpse." "Curious," said Wimsey. "You and he may have passed like ships in the night, though I imagine one was rather more watertight." Prewet didn't smile. "Tell me," said Wimsey, his tone light, "what do you know of Haverley Cross?" Prewet looked startled. "Nothing. Why?" "There's no shame in it. A ruined priory, once the haunt of gloomy monks and their more enterprising enemies. A boy saw our victim walking in that direction this morning. I wondered if you'd crossed paths." "I didn't." "Strange, though, that a man might wander off the train, head toward a ruin, and be found dead in a picnic grove, without ever passing anyone on the way. I can't explain that. No, nor can he." Wimsey stood and moved to the mantel, where a single photograph sat in a stiff silver frame. It was of a young woman, severe of aspect, seated on a bench beside what appeared to be a beehive. "Your wife?" "Sister. She looks formidable." "She was." Wimsey turned. "Was?" Prewet's expression closed like a book. "She died 2 years ago. Tuberculosis." "I'm sorry to hear that." There was a silence. Wimsey set down his cup. "Well," he said, "I thank you for your time. One hates to be a disturbance in such orderly surroundings. But a man dying on parish grounds tends to generate questions. I hope you find your Answers quickly. Don't we all, said Wimsey and bowed them out. Back on the lane, Miss Moorcroft exhaled. He was nervous. Wimsey nodded. He was also lying. About the footpath? About everything. He saw the man, possibly spoke to him, but he's determined not to have done so. Why? Wimsey smiled. Ah, that's the question, isn't it? They had not gone far before they were accosted by Mrs. Tilling, the vicarage's most indefatigable gossip, and the proud owner of the pug with nervous lungs. She descended upon them like a thundercloud in tweed, clutching an umbrella and trailing the faint scent of mothballs and lavender polish. Lord Peter. Miss Moorcroft, you must come with me this instant. Wimsey raised an eyebrow. Good heavens, has another corpse appeared? Not yet. But Mr. Bliss, you know Mr. Bliss, the undertaker's nephew, rather sly about the ears, says the man from the wood was inquiring after Lady Catamole. That arrested Wimsey's step. He what? He went into the station-master's office. Yesterday morning. Mr. Bliss happened to be there waiting for a parcel. He said the man asked about getting to Witherford Grange. Witherford Grange is Lady Catamole's house. Precisely. Was she expecting a visitor? Mrs. Tilling's eyes shone. She says not. I've already written to her housekeeper. Wimsey blinked. My dear woman, were you a footman in Vienna during the Congress? You could not be more efficiently indiscreet. She preened. Wimsey turned to Miss Moorcroft. And so the stranger came to visit a lady who claims not to know him, walked 3 miles in the wrong direction, and ended up murdered at a picnic he wasn't invited to. Miss Moorcroft looked grim. Perhaps he found out something he wasn't meant to know. Or, said Wimsey, perhaps he failed to find something he was meant to know. Either way, the connection to Lady Catamole must be pursued. Let's call on her, shall we? But before they could do so, the constable appeared, his bicycle wobbling with the urgency of bad news. He dismounted in front of them with such force that his cap nearly followed suit. "My lord," he panted, "you're wanted at the station. Sergeant Havelock says the post-mortem's done, and they found something odd in the man's coat lining." Wimsey's eyes gleamed. At last the plot thickens like cold gravy, and with that he turned on his heel and strode off toward the station, already whistling a madrigal in 3-part harmony, while behind him the village buzzed with half-truths and the sound of bees hard at work in Prewet's garden. The police station in Lesser Whipple occupied the lower half of a brick building that once served as the county records office. Its upper story had been given over to pigeon housing unofficially some years prior. Lord Peter Wimsey arrived just as the station clock marked the half-hour, with a cough of rust and misaligned chimes. Inside, Sergeant Havelock stood with the squareness of a man who considered deviations in posture a moral failing. "Afternoon. Milord," he said, nodding curtly. "We've something you'll want to see. Not another corpse, I hope?" Wimsey removed his gloves with fencer's grace and dropped them into a pocket. "No, just the first one, rendered slightly more enlightening." They walked through to the small back room that doubled as both evidence lockup and interrogation space. The body, decently covered, was laid out on a wooden table beneath a window. The air was faintly antiseptic, with a top note of boiled wool and old soap. The doctor, a wiry man with an ironic moustache and the manner of someone habitually disappointed in spleens, gave a brief nod. "Time of death sometime between 11 and 1, he began without ceremony. "Blunt trauma to the base of the skull. No weapon found, no defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. It was clean, possibly done from behind." "Efficient," murmured Wimsey, peering under the sheet. "Yes, which makes the absence of any valuable stranger. Wallet, yes, but nothing personal. No papers, no watch, no signet ring. Even the lining of his coat had been interfered with." "Interfered with?" Havelock stepped forward and produced a scrap of stiff, yellowing parchment, folded into quarters, stained faintly along the edges. He passed it to Wimsey, who unfolded it with care. It was a fragment of an architectural drawing, clearly old, possibly Victorian, depicting a floor plan of a building labelled Haverley Priory, South Wing, subterranean access. There were measurements, in inches and rods, a heavy black X in one corner, and a faint annotation in spidery handwriting. Access sealed 1873, no entry without diocesan approval. "Good heavens," said Wimsey, eyebrows rising. "We are in Gothic country." "Recognize it?" Havelock asked. "I've seen similar things. Old estate records, diocesan archives. But this appears to be hand-drawn, perhaps a personal copy." "Where exactly was it found?" "Inside the coat lining, stitched between fabric and silk. Would have gone unnoticed if the hem hadn't torn in the fall." Wimsey turned the paper in his hands. Someone went to considerable lengths to hide. "This?" Miss Moorcroft, who had entered quietly, leaned in. "If he brought it with him deliberately, perhaps he meant to explore the priory." "Or prove something existed beneath it," Wimsey replied, tapping the X with a thoughtful finger. "You don't travel from London with a Victorian floor plan sewn into your coat, unless you're either very eccentric or pursuing a secret." "Or being chased," said Havelock. Wimsey smiled. "Quite so, but then why no torch, no tools, no provisions? If he was planning a delve into ruined foundations, he was uncommonly casual about it." "Could he have met someone there?" Miss Moorcroft asked. Wimsey nodded slowly. "Yes, someone who didn't want him to arrive." He folded the parchment and handed it back. "Have you checked the London missing persons reports? We've sent a wire. No matches yet, but it's only been a day." "Well," Wimsey said, "let us suppose he was expected by someone near Haverley Cross, but he strayed, perhaps saw someone following him, panicked, changed direction, or someone met him en route." "The path forks below the ridge," said Miss Moorcroft. "One route to the priory, one back toward the church grove. And he ended up dead, facing the wrong way, with no map and a fragment of history hidden in his coat." He turned to Havelock. "I'd like to see the priory ruins. You may bring your truncheon if you like." Haverley Cross stood like a ghost in the middle of a gorse-covered field. What had once been a priory of considerable size was now reduced to little more than a low stone apse, a scattering of knee-high walls, and one remaining arch, which stood like a crooked tooth against the pale sky. A rusted iron gate barred casual access, but Wimsey vaulted it with the ease of someone who considered boundaries suggestive rather than prohibitive. Miss Moorcroft and Havelock joined him a moment later, the latter less gracefully. The ruin exuded that curious loneliness peculiar to sacred places abandoned by time. Wind moved through the grass in murmurs. The stone underfoot was slick with moss. Wimsey moved with purpose. He traced the foundation lines, then paused at a worn depression in the earth near the southern wall. A half-buried slab protruded there, weathered, but not cracked. He knelt, brushed it with a gloved hand, and found an iron ring set into the center. "Well, well," he murmured. "The seal of secrecy." Havelock squatted beside him. "It's a hatch." "Indeed. And likely the access noted on our deceased's map." He tugged at the ring. It resisted. "Not been opened in decades, perhaps longer, but it is a door, or once was." Miss Moorcroft stepped back, uneasy. "It's like something out of a story." "Everything is," said Wimsey, rising, "until someone bleeds." He looked around. "There's no sign of tampering, which means our man never got this far. So, did someone else already know what's beneath? Or was he silenced before he could find out?" They lingered until the sun began to droop toward the horizon. Back at the vicarage, Mrs. Strathmore offered supper, cold tongue and pickled walnuts, which Wimsey declined with elaborate sorrow. Instead, he retired to the guest room, where he spread the sketch of the priory on the writing desk and studied it in the lamplight. The architecture was familiar. These old religious buildings were not designed for secrecy, but they were modified across centuries for uses both sacred and profane. Smugglers, recusants, relic hunters. The sealed passage could be anything, but it wasn't the passage that kept his mind turning. It was the neatness of the murder, the lack of resistance, the absence of any other clue. Someone had killed quickly and left nothing, except a body placed as if in performance just on the edge of visibility. That, more than anything, troubled him. Downstairs the vicar's clock chimed 9. Wimsey rose and opened the window, letting in the night air. Somewhere in the dark, a single bee buzzed in slow, irregular loops near the sill, and in the distance, beyond the dark line of trees, a dog began to bark, once, twice, then silence. He turned back to the map, and under his breath, as though repeating something he had only now understood, murmured, "Sealed in 1873, no entry without diocesan approval." He smiled. "Unless one has already been inside." And the next morning, he would pay a second visit to Mr. Prewett, this time not to speak of headaches but of hexagons, hives, and hidden histories. It was just past 8 when Lord Peter Wimsey returned to the ivy-shrouded old schoolhouse. The sky was that hard metallic grey peculiar to English mornings that have not yet decided whether they intend rain or merely gloom. Miss Moorcroft, having gone to interview the station-master's wife about the dead man's train ticket, was spared what promised to be an awkward call. Wimsey, however, walked up the gravel path with the ease of a man bringing bad news to breakfast. "Shut." Prewett answered in shirt-sleeves and an expression of measured frost. "Lord Peter," he said, glancing briefly at the sky as if hoping it might devour his visitor. "You're early." "Curiosity is a cruel alarm clock," Wimsey replied. "And I found myself thinking about bees." Prewett stiffened perceptibly. "I beg your pardon." "I was admiring your apiary yesterday," Wimsey said, stepping through the threshold without waiting for invitation. "All very orderly. Italian strain, I take it." "Carnolian, actually." "Ah, the gentler temper. Less prone to stinging, more inclined to secrecy." Prewett closed the door with deliberation. "To what do I owe this visit?" Wimsey turned in the hallway, hands clasped behind his back. "To a puzzle. One that begins with a man travelling under no name, dies on a church path without apparent enemies, and carries in his coat lining an old floor plan of Haverley Priory. And, more specifically, to something I found near the stile." Prewett raised an eyebrow. "I thought the constabulary scoured that area. Not as thoroughly as they might. There was a smear of something near the gatepost. Barely visible, really. A kind of honey, not wild. Something refined. Domestic." "I see," said Prewett evenly. "And you thought of me? Your hives are the only registered ones in the parish, and the victim had no pollen on his clothes. So if the honey came from his killer, it must have been transferred during the blow." "Assuming you're correct," Prewett said, folding. His arms. "What does that prove?" "That you're a man of habit," said Wimsey. "People who keep bees tend to carry traces of them. Resin on the cuffs, wax in the seams, a faint scent. One drop of honey doesn't make you a murderer, but it makes you interesting." Prewett gave a hollow laugh. "You think I hit a man on the head with a honey jar? I think you knew him. And I think he came here looking for something, perhaps not you directly, perhaps for what lies beneath the priory ruins." Prewett's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes flickered. "There's nothing beneath that ruin," he said too quickly. Wimsey cocked his head. "You're quite sure?" Prewett walked away without answering, retreating, toward the back of the house. Wimsey followed him into the conservatory, a glass-walled room that overlooked the garden and the bee-boxes beyond. "My sister," Prewett said, staring out toward the hives, "was an amateur historian. She had an obsession with the priory, spent years collecting papers, maps, ecclesiastical records, old letters, said she believed there was something hidden beneath the south wall, some sealed chamber." Wimsey said nothing. She grew ill. Prewett went on, voice lower now. Tuberculosis. In the last few months she became consumed. Said there were things the diocese buried, not just stonework, secrets. She had a theory that some relic or manuscript, maybe even treasure, had been hidden during the dissolution. And did she ever try to excavate? Prewett shook his head. Too sick, but she wrote letters, to archives, to scholars, even to collectors. Collectors, murmured Wimsey, including, perhaps, our unknown visitor. I don't know. She died before anything came of it. Afterward, I burned most of her papers. Foolishness. Not all of them, Wimsey said softly. Prewett turned. What do you mean? Wimsey drew a folded paper from his pocket, the architectural sketch found in the corpse's coat lining, and laid it gently on the table. This came from the dead man's coat. He had it sewn into the lining. Your sister's notations. Prewett stared, said nothing. She sent it to him, didn't she? Or he stole it or bought it from someone who did. Finally, Prewett sank into a chair. She posted several copies, he admitted, to antiquarian societies, one to a London address. I don't remember the name. Perhaps his name wasn't on the envelope. I didn't keep the receipts. Wimsey nodded. So the man comes here, follows her trail. Perhaps he intended to speak to you. Perhaps he planned to go straight to the priory, but somewhere someone learns he's come, and what he's carrying, and that person decides the past must stay buried. Prewett looked up sharply. You think I think you lied yesterday. That makes you suspicious, but not guilty. What I don't understand is this. Why deny having seen him if you had nothing to hide? Prewett's jaw worked. For a moment, Wimsey thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because I did see him, Prewett said finally. Yesterday morning, on the ridge path, he stopped me, asked if I was related to Marjorie Prewett, said he was following up a letter, wanted to see the priory ruins. And I told him to go back to London, that there was nothing here. He was persistent, so I got angry. I said if he didn't leave, I'd inform the vicar and the constable. And then he laughed, said I was guarding something. Then walked off down the lower trail. That's the path toward the church grove, said Wimsey, where we found him. Prewett nodded. I didn't follow him. Are you sure? I swear it. Wimsey looked at him for a long moment. Then someone else did. He stood. Thank you. I don't think you killed him, Mr. Prewett, but I think someone else feared what he might uncover. About my sister? About the priory, or what's beneath it? As he turned to go, Prewett called after him. Do you think there is something down there? Wimsey didn't turn back. I think your sister wasn't mad, merely inconvenient. By the time he reached the lane, the drizzle had returned. The wind picked up from the west, bringing the smell of heather and wet stone. Miss Moorcroft waited by the stile, her umbrella barely adequate. News from the station master, she said. The dead man's ticket was a return, purchased in London, no luggage, name given H. Lovell. False, most likely, said Wimsey, or a partial truth. Also, she continued, Lady Cattermole's housekeeper sent a reply. The lady did receive a letter last week from a man claiming to be researching monastic holdings in the Shropshire area. She dismissed it as a crank. So he wrote, To her, Wimsey murmured, to Prewett's sister, to anyone he thought might know. And someone didn't like that, Miss Moorcroft said quietly. No, said Wimsey, and I think we're very close to finding out who. They turned back toward the village, walking side by side beneath the uncertain sky, as somewhere behind them, unseen, the bees worked quietly over ancient earth. The following morning broke pale and windless, with the sort of colourless dawn that made everything appear as though viewed through unwashed glass. Lord Peter Wimsey, up early by bachelor standards, strolled through the graveyard of St. Stephen's with a cinnamon twist from Mrs. Worsley's bakery in one hand and a rolled architectural drawing in the other. He seemed, to the casual observer, to be in no great hurry, though anyone who knew Wimsey well, and Miss Moorcroft was quickly becoming one such, would have recognized the signs of active thinking. His stride was too even, his gaze too blank, and the pastry was untouched. He paused at the path where the dead man had been found, studying the line of trees and the distant outline of the ruined priory beyond. A crow cawed from the yew tree above, sounding more sarcastic than ominous. "Time and topography," Wimsey murmured aloud, "are the most insufferably honest of witnesses." From behind him Miss Moorcroft's voice rang out. "The post arrived, Lord Peter." She came hurrying down the gravelled path from the vicarage, holding a telegram with the cautious distaste of someone delivering a war bulletin. "From London," she added, "Scotland Yard's Records Office. A reply to your inquiry about H. Lovell." Wimsey raised an eyebrow and took the paper. He read swiftly, then let out a low whistle. Well, Mr. H. Lovell turns out to be one Hugh Lovell Smythe. No fixed address, but known in antiquarian circles. Occasional lecturer on monastic history. Dismissed from the British Museum 5 years ago for misappropriating a 14th century chalice. A thief. An enthusiast with boundary issues. Never charged but gently removed. Since then he's surfaced in Paris, Florence, and apparently Lesser Whipple. The museum noted his obsession with lost ecclesiastical holdings, particularly those thought to have vanished during the Reformation. Our floor plan fits the profile rather too well. Miss Moorcroft's brow furrowed. If he came here hoping to find hidden treasure, then someone else with the same knowledge decided to beat him to it, Wimsey finished. He turned, now alert. "Have you seen Felicia Ardsmore this morning?" "She left the vicarage quite early," said Miss Moorcroft. "Told her aunt she had rehearsal in the church hall, but Mrs. Strathmore says she had no costume bags and wasn't wearing her usual stage scarf." "Felicia," said Wimsey thoughtfully, "has a very inconvenient amount of nerve. And the keys to the church." He set off at once, Miss Moorcroft hurrying to keep up. They crossed the square and turned down the lane beside the almshouses, approaching the stone-walled hall that served as both theatre and community centre. The door was ajar. A faint creak of floorboards within betrayed movement. "Dramatic timing, as always," murmured Wimsey, and pushed the door fully open. Inside, the air was cool and dry. Felicia Ardsmore stood on a ladder, wrestling with the latch of the high window. She wore trousers, an oversized cardigan, and an expression of guilt that tried and failed to resemble indignation. "Lord Peter," she said, stepping down, "and Miss Moorcroft, to what do I owe this performance review?" "Dress rehearsal?" Wimsey asked mildly, eyes sweeping the room. "I wanted to air the place out," Felicia replied too quickly. "It smells of mildew." "You have a strong grip for a dramatist," he said, nodding toward the crowbar resting on the windowsill. She flushed. "It's for scenery." "I'm sure," Wimsey said, his tone still genial, "though it's an odd sort of prop to bring to the ruins of a 12th century priory." She froze. "I beg your pardon?" "The vicar's boy saw you leaving the house at dawn," said Miss Moorcroft, heading toward the priory field. Felicia's jaw tightened. "I don't see what business that is of anyone's." "When it concerns a murder," Wimsey said softly. "Everything is someone's business." She sat down abruptly on the edge of the stage. "I didn't kill him." "Then tell us what you were doing at the priory." She hesitated, staring down at her hands. Then, with a sudden exhalation, she spoke. "I followed him," she said. "The day he arrived, I saw him at the post office, asking about the ruins, the history of the parish. He was too deliberate, like he was acting curious rather than being curious." "You followed him to the ridge?" She nodded. "And I overheard his conversation with Mr. Prewitt. That man, Lovell Smythe, he accused Prewett of hiding something, said he had letters. Letters from Marjorie Prewett, I suppose. I didn't catch all of it. But when he walked off, I stayed. I wanted to know what was so important. Did you go to the Priory then? No. Not then, but I started reading up. Old journals, Marjorie's church notes. She used to help with the archives. And there was one entry, a line. S-Wing sealed 1873 after incident. Father Asher's vault, unclear. And that was enough. She looked up. You know how dull it is here, plays and teas and bake sales, and then, suddenly, a mystery. A real one. I thought if I could just find what he was looking for, maybe I could be someone. Wimsey said nothing. I went out again this morning. Thought I'd get into the crypt. I brought the crowbar. I was trying to lift the old slab. Did you succeed? No, it's sealed with iron. I couldn't shift it. Then I saw someone coming from the far field and panicked. I came back here. Wimsey nodded slowly. That was sensible. And the man Lovell Smythe, when did you last see him? Not again after the ridge, but I saw someone else. And who? She bit her lip. I think Mr. Strickland. The organist? She nodded. Yesterday afternoon, near the wood's edge, he was coming back from the Priory Lane, fast, like he didn't want to be seen. Wimsey turned on his heel. Where does Mr. Strickland live? With his mother on Mill Pond Lane. Miss Moorcroft frowned. You think he killed Lovell Smythe? I think he has a great deal to explain. They left the hall at once, heading toward the mill. Strickland's house was a sagging, Tudor affair, its beams warped like arthritic limbs. The organist himself, a thin man with a twitchy moustache and fingers that never quite stopped moving, answered the door in shirt sleeves. Lord Peter, he said warily, I'm rather busy. Lessons this morning. I shan't detain you. Long, said Wimsey. Just a question about your whereabouts yesterday between 11 and 2. Strickland's eyes darted. I was home, he said, all morning. Anyone see you? My mother. Who is deaf and bedridden, said Miss Moorcroft. Strickland flushed. Mr. Strickland, said Wimsey. Do you know the name Hugh? Lovell Smythe? No. Did you ever correspond with Marjorie Prewett about the Priory? No. You attended her funeral. Strickland blinked. I played the hymn. Indeed. And yet, according to Mrs. Strathmore's records, you borrowed her notebook from the parish archives 2 weeks ago, the one marked Monastic Foundations, Historical Footnotes. Strickland's hand stilled. She wasn't mad, he whispered. There's something down there. I found the same sketch. I knew someone would come. I didn't mean to. Wimsey held up a hand. Let's be clear. Did you kill him? Strickland swallowed. He said he had a claim, that he'd sell what he found. I only meant to scare him off, but he laughed. Said I'd never get there first. I pushed him. He fell, hit the stone. It wasn't planned. Wimsey's expression didn't change. And you took the map? Strickland nodded, but didn't. Find the chamber. No, Wimsey exhaled. Then I'm afraid you're under arrest, Mr. Strickland. Strickland sagged. As Havelock arrived to take him in, Wimsey stood back in the garden, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the Priory ruin crouched like a forgotten beast. Miss Moorcroft came to stand beside him. You knew? I suspected, he said. But it was Felicia's crowbar that proved the slab was sealed. Strickland's lie unravelled from there. And the treasure? Wimsey smiled faintly. Sometimes the treasure is just the secret, and sometimes keeping it costs more than gold. The wind rose softly over the village, and somewhere in the field beyond the church the bees hummed on. That evening, Lesser Whipple returned, with faintly embarrassed British decorum, to the business of pretending nothing had happened. The E. Villagers walked with exaggerated calm past the churchyard path. The vicar resumed his mild discourse on Paul's epistle to the Galatians. And Mrs. Strathmore served a casserole of such grim finality that even Lord Peter Wimsey dared not offer comment. though he suspected it had been prepared as a culinary counterweight to the week's chaos. But Wimsey was not content. Something remained unresolved. He leaned against the window frame in the drawing room of the vicarage, sipping black coffee and watching the mist cling to the grass like gossip. Miss Moorcroft, seated in the corner with a notebook, caught the change in his expression. "Hugh." "Don't think it's over," she said. Wimsey turned, his gaze distant. "Not quite. Strickland killed Lovell Smythe, yes, but he didn't steal the floor plan. He left it sewn in the coat. And if one is trying to find a hidden chamber, one doesn't leave the only map behind." Miss Moorcroft frowned. "You think someone else was involved?" "I think someone else got there first, and I think Lovell Smythe knew it." She set down the notebook. "Then why didn't he leave?" "Because he thought he could outwit them." Wimsey stood, pacing. He knew there was something under that ruin. He knew someone else had begun digging, and he planned to intercept it, perhaps steal the prize, or expose the trespass. And Strickland just happened to be the one to stop him. Strickland was frightened, eager, not calculating. He didn't mean to kill him, but someone else intended the result. There was a pause. Then Miss Moorcroft said, "Mr. Prewitt." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "Indeed." She stood now, crossing to the desk. "We never confirmed how much he knew of his sister's research, and Felicia mentioned letters. Plural. What if Lovell Smythe had found something more? A second sketch, or instructions?" "More damning still," said Wimsey softly. "What if he found evidence the site had already been disturbed?" "Not recently, but decades ago." Miss Moorcroft stared at him. "Prewitt's sister. Marjorie Prewitt was a bright woman, determined, obsessed with the Priory. She died conveniently before she could act. Prewitt said it was illness, but she was researching underground ruins, writing strangers, perhaps planning to excavate." Wimsey paused. What if she found something, or tried to, and someone, her brother say, put a stop to it? "You think he killed her?" "Perhaps. Not deliberately. But tuberculosis has many faces. Isolation, neglect, concealment. What if she was kept just ill enough to remain out of the way?" There was a long silence. Then Miss Moorcroft asked, "Do you believe the chamber exists?" "I'm quite sure." "Of it?" He opened the drawer of the desk and removed the floor plan again. Holding it under the lamplight, he tapped the heavy X in the southern quadrant. "This section aligns with the remaining south wall. The sealed access is just beyond it. Felicia couldn't open the hatch, but someone might. Mr. Prewitt, he knows the terrain, and yesterday when I questioned him about the drawing he hesitated, not at the idea of the chamber, but at the suggestion someone else might reach it." "Then we need to go there," Miss Moorcroft said, a little breathlessly. "We do," said Wimsey, "before someone else does." They set out at dawn the next day, reaching the Priory field just as the horizon cracked open in dull amber. The grass was still wet, and the earth smelled of loam and memory. Wimsey carried a lantern and a small iron pry bar. Miss Moorcroft wore gloves and a scarf and had tucked her hair into a knitted cap against the wind. The ruin was deserted. They passed beneath the broken arch and found the southern slab exactly where Wimsey had marked it the day before. He knelt beside it and inserted the edge of the bar beneath the iron ring. "It didn't move, help me," he said. She knelt beside him, hands gripping the iron with his, and together they pulled. At first nothing gave, but then, with a rasping groan, the stone shifted upward. Beneath it a stair descended into earth. Cold air rose, tinged with damp and something older. Wimsey lit the lantern. "After you," he said gallantly. "I think not." He grinned and went first. The stairwell was narrow, the steps shallow and uneven. The air was thick with dust. At the bottom, the passage widened into a vaulted chamber, low-ceilinged and lined with stone niches, some empty, some filled with crumbling remains of what might once have been ossuary boxes. A small iron gate blocked the far side, and on the floor, half buried beneath old boards and disturbed gravel, lay a rotted leather satchel. Wimsey knelt. Inside were scraps of parchment, water-damaged and marked with ecclesiastical seals. A bronze cross, and tucked into the lining, 3 letters bound with faded ribbon. He opened one carefully. It was addressed to the diocese, dated 1873. After the incident involving Brother Asher, I have sealed the southern chamber. The relic will remain under holy protection, but I strongly urge no further exploration. Its presence has already brought temptation. Wimsey exhaled. Brother Asher's vault, he murmured. The final clue. Behind him, Miss Moorcroft had grown still. Listen, she whispered. Footsteps. Above them. Wimsey extinguished the lantern. They stood in darkness as the sound of boots moved across the ruin. Then a voice. Lord Peter. Toe. SAYERS Prewet. He descended slowly, a torch in one hand, and stopped when he saw them. I thought I might find you here, he said. How prescient, Wimsey replied coolly. Or perhaps you've come to check your hiding place. Prewet's face was pale in the flickering light. I didn't kill Lovell Smythe, he said. No, Wimsey agreed. Strickland did that. But I think you killed your sister. Prewet said nothing. You kept her isolated, Wimsey continued. Convinced others she was mad, burned her correspondence, but she had already sent out copies. She'd found something. Down here, a sealed chamber, and she intended to expose it. She was ill. She was inconvenient, said Wimsey. Prewet's hand clenched on the torch. She would have destroyed it all, the sanctity of it, turned it into a headline. So you made sure no one believed her. I nursed her every day, Prewet said. Until she stopped speaking, until she didn't know me. I didn't kill her, but I didn't help her either. The silence was heavy. Then Wimsey said gently, You could have brought her work to light properly, preserved it. She didn't want preservation. She wanted spectacle. Miss Moorcroft stepped forward. And what do you want now, Mr. Prewet? He looked at her, and for a moment his expression cracked open. Grief, guilt, and something like relief flickered through. To forget, he whispered. Wimsey looked down at the satchel. Well, I'm afraid history rarely allows that. Prewet turned and climbed back up the stair in silence. When they emerged into morning, he was gone, and the priory lay as before, broken, patient, waiting. Later, at the vicarage, Wimsey handed the satchel and its contents to the diocesan archivist with precise instructions. Strickland would be tried for manslaughter. Prewet had left a letter of confession and vanished. Perhaps to the continent, perhaps not. Felicia Ardsmore returned to writing plays. Miss Moorcroft resumed her duties, and Lord Peter Wimsey, with a final glance toward the field, took his leave in the Lagonda, quoting Horace and refusing to explain himself. But before he went, he left a small brass plaque at the edge of the priory. Here was found the truth, sealed, hidden, and unearthed, not by force, but by questions patiently asked and gently answered, and the bees kept humming just the same. It was a week later, and the village of Lesser Whipple had begun, in that resolutely English fashion, to allow the whole matter to settle quietly into the sediment of shared memory. A man had died, another had been arrested, a third had vanished, and now people were once again discussing the more reliable pleasures of jam recipes, the restoration of the church kneelers, and whether the vicar's recent sermon on moral laxity had been directed at anyone in particular. Only the priory ruin remained as it had always been, silent, patient, and now politely roped off with a modest sign from the Diocesan Historical Society. Lord Peter Wimsey, for his part, had not yet departed. I can't help feeling, he said, idly buttering a crumpet in the vicarage kitchen, that we are not quite done. Miss Moorcroft looked up from the table where she was arranging papers and receipts related to the incident. I thought everything was resolved. Strickland confessed. The hidden chamber has been documented. Mr. Prewett vanished. Wimsey gave a thin smile. Vanished is such a vague word. It covers so many sins, from absconding to suicide, to taking up piano lessons in Florence. But yes, he is gone, and that in itself may be the problem. She set down her pen. You think he's hiding something more? Wimsey leaned back in his chair. Let me pose you a question. What if the Priory chamber wasn't the only thing Marjorie Prewett found? You mean there's another, not necessarily another chamber, but perhaps another document, something not sent to Lovell Smythe, something not destroyed by her brother, something she hid. Miss Moorcroft frowned. But why would she hide it? Because she suspected she was being watched or silenced. Suppose she knew Prewett was interfering. Suppose she wanted one piece of proof to survive. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. This arrived this morning. Forwarded from my London address. He slid it across the table. It was addressed in a careful, looping hand to Lord Peter Wimsey, Esquire, the return address number 4 The Parade, Ludlow. She sent it to you? Miss Moorcroft asked, wide-eyed. Or had someone sent it on her behalf, said Wimsey. Postmarked. 4 years ago. Inside was a folded sheet of foolscap paper, brittle at the edges. It was written in a neat but erratic hand. If anything happens to me, tell them not to trust my brother. He wants to protect the past. I want to understand it. The Priory held more than relics. It held choices. There are things the Church buried, not to preserve but to forget. Let the truth come out. MP Miss Moorcroft was silent for a long moment. This changes everything. Wimsey tapped the table. It confirms what we suspected. Marjorie knew her brother feared exposure. Perhaps he didn't mean to let her die, but he did nothing to stop it. He silenced her truth. But the letter didn't reach anyone, because the person entrusted with it chose not to send it, until now. Which leads us to the final player in our little melodrama. Miss Moorcroft blinked. There's another. Wimsey nodded. Lady Catamole. The Marchioness. She received a letter from Lovell Smythe. Claimed she ignored it. But Felicia's cousin works at Witherford Grange. I wrote to her, quite unofficially, and she confirmed that Lady Catamole was very disturbed by the inquiry. Ordered all household documents removed from the library the day after the letter arrived. Claimed it was spring cleaning in October. Do you think she knew what was under the Priory? Not in full, but I believe she knew something. Her family, through the Collingbournes, held stewardship over Haverley lands after the dissolution. They were granted access to monastic properties. They may have sealed the chamber. Miss Moorcroft said, then Lovell Smythe's death also protected her legacy. Precisely. The truth beneath the Priory would have damaged not just ecclesiastical history, but landed inheritance, a chain of influence and silence. And you think she persuaded Prewett to hide it? I think she provided cover, gave him enough doubt, to act or not act, depending on your view of mercy. Either way, she knew the weight of truth and preferred the weight of tradition. Miss Moorcroft stood. Then shouldn't we expose her? No, said Wimsey. She has already buried herself in a mausoleum of her own making. What matters is that the document survives, that Marjorie's voice is heard. That truth outlasts protection. He finished his crumpet. Besides, she's 83, and as fond of port as she is of the peerage. The world will tidy itself in due course. They sat in companionable silence for a while, broken only by the distant sound of a postman's bicycle and the soft hum of Mrs. Strathmore reciting morning devotions. Then Wimsey said, "Tell me, Miss Moorcroft, what will you do now?" She blinked. Do? You've proved yourself remarkably adept at investigative work, calm under pressure, intellectually curious, not afraid of muddy shoes or the obscure Latin of church ledgers. She smiled, unsure. If it was a compliment or a proposal, "I expect I'll stay here," she said. "The vicar still needs help with the archives, and someone must sort out the choir's sheet music." "A loss to the larger criminal justice community," said Wimsey with mock solemnity. She laughed. "And you, Lord Peter. Back to London." "Soon. Bunter will have reorganized my library out of spite by now. But I confess, I've grown rather fond of Shropshire's damp mysteries, and there's something to be said for village tea." She paused. "Will you write about it?" Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "Oh, certainly not. One must draw the line somewhere. The Times would never forgive me for ending a column with bee stings and medieval guilt." He stood and stretched. "Well, I suppose it's time I took my leave. There's a train at noon, unless the signalman decides to die inconveniently again." He made for the door, but paused at the threshold. "Miss Moorcroft," he said, "if you should stumble upon any further unsolved murders, cryptic manuscripts or local legends involving invisible bells or haunted butter churns, do drop me a line." She smiled. "I shall keep my ears open." He gave her a slight bow, the kind that suggested he knew a great deal more than he let on, and then he was gone, down the garden path, coat collar up, hat tilted, walking once more into a world full of eccentric sin and minor clergy. That night, Miss Moorcroft walked alone to the Priory ruins. The wind had picked up, stirring the grass in long whispers. The sky was heavy with stars. She paused at the stone arch, gazing down into the field that had in its silence sheltered so many secrets. She placed the envelope in the small weatherproof chest marked "Historical Submissions, recently erected," by the Diocesan Society. Then she turned, hands in her pockets, and walked home, unhurried, at ease, and unafraid. Behind her, the wind moved again through the stones, and somewhere beyond the church, the bees murmured in the dark. The week that followed Lord Peter Wimsey's departure was one of cautious adjustment. Lesser Whipple, ever discreet, began to absorb the scandal into its sediment of shared silence. The name Hugh Lovell Smythe faded first. Then came the careful forgetting of Mr. Strickland, whose mother was quietly moved to an almshouse in Ludlow. Prewitt was never spoken of directly. Only Marjorie's name was permitted a tentative resurrection, whispered with a belated respect by those who had previously regarded her as eccentric or frail. Miss Catherine Moorcroft, for her part, had not forgotten anything. She had developed a habit, not yet remarked upon by the vicar's wife, of walking each afternoon to the edge of the Priory ruins. She never strayed beyond the new wooden fence. But she stood there, hands in her pockets, looking out over the stone foundations with a calm and unsettling intensity, as though waiting for history itself to stir. It was on one such afternoon that she was joined unexpectedly. "You're watching?" "Ghosts again," said Felicia Ardsmore, who had crept up the lane in heeled boots thoroughly unsuited to Shropshire clay. Her usual theatrical flair was dampened by the fog, but the set of her jaw remained boldly tragic. "I'm remembering," Catherine replied. Felicia came to stand beside her. "I'm writing it as a play," she said matter-of-factly. "Names. Changed, of course. But the bones of it, the Priory, the sealed chamber, the poor woman silenced by those closest to her. It's got a sort of Gothic justice, don't you think?" Catherine turned to her, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Justice is a word that suffers from overuse and underdefinition." Felicia gave her a sideways glance. "You sound like him." Catherine's mouth quirked. "That's because I've been reading what he left behind." "You mean Lord Peter's notes?" "Mm-hmm. Indeed, Wimsey had posted a parcel to the vicarage not 2 days after leaving. Thin, elegant handwriting on the label, a wax seal, under the flap. Inside, a set of typed pages stitched at the top corner and titled simply, "On the Psychological Dispositions of the English Village and Other Quiet Catastrophes." Not a narrative, he'd written in the covering note. But a meditation. You understand the difference, I'm sure. Catherine had read it twice already. He wrote of silence, how English villages could consume the unbearable truths of their past, preserving them beneath gentle rituals and deference. He wrote of Mr. Prewett not as a villain, but as a man who had confused preservation with love. He wrote of Marjorie not as a martyr, but as a woman who refused to leave the past alone. And he wrote of truth not as a blade or a balm, but as something more stubborn, slow, and essential. Like root systems beneath old yew trees. Did he mention me? Felicia asked suddenly. Catherine looked at her. No. Felicia laughed too brightly. Well, I suppose I wasn't one of the important ones, just comic relief. You were never that, said Catherine gently. But you were a witness, that matters, Felicia sniffed. It's hard, you know, living in the wings. Catherine didn't respond. She was watching something in the distance, a small figure coming up the field from the far edge of the ruins. A boy no older than 10 in a cap far too large for him and boots that sloshed in the mud. That's Alec Weston, she said, the bird watcher. He looks like a Dickens orphan, said Felicia. Alec approached, hat in hand. Miss Moorcroft, he said, my aunt says I'm to give you this. He handed over a small object, a brass button, worn but polished, bearing the crest of the British Museum. I found it yesterday, he added. Near the stile. Catherine turned it over in her fingers. It must have belonged to Mr. Lovell Smythe. I thought it might be important, Alec said solemnly, even if it's just a little bit. It's not little, she said, and meant it. He grinned, saluted with the odd earnestness of small boys imitating soldiers, and disappeared back the way he'd come. Felicia folded her arms. They'll all forget him soon, you know. Everyone. No one really wants to remember a stranger who died far from home. Catherine pocketed the button. Then we'll remember him for them. They stood in silence for a moment longer before Felicia cleared her throat and said, I suppose I'd better go. Mother's expecting me to audition a new alto for the carol service. Pray for us. She left in a swirl of inadequate scarf and disappointed romance. Catherine remained a while, longer, her breath visible in the cold air. Her thoughts were not sentimental. She was thinking, as Wimsey had, about the nature of secrecy. How many lives had twisted not because of malice, but because someone had chosen not to say a single, simple thing at the right time. She wondered how often the real danger wasn't a hidden chamber or an ancient relic, but what people did to keep them hidden. She walked back through the village slowly, past the cottage windows aglow with kettle light, past the pub where locals now referred to that business, with a casual shake of the head and a pint raised in philosophical exasperation. Past the church, where the bell rope had been retied and Mrs. Tilling was rehearsing the new hymns with theatrical vigour. At the vicarage, she found a letter waiting. It bore a familiar hand. Miss Moorcroft, it read, I find myself quite unable to stay put, and even less able to forget the curious little angles of your mind. Should you ever tire of parish records and amateur dramatists, you might consider assisting me in more formal inquiries. I can promise nothing so pastoral as beehives or collapsing monks, but the people are just as strange. Yours most sincerely, P. She folded it carefully and placed it on the mantel. She did not answer it yet. Instead, she returned to her desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper. At the top, she wrote, On certain matters. Left, unsaid, notes toward a history. Of the Haverley incident, and beneath that, it began, as so many things do in England, with a picnic that never happened. What followed was not a tragedy, though there was loss, nor was it quite a mystery, though there were secrets. It was rather a matter of inheritance, not of money or land, but of silence, truth, and the very human difficulty of knowing which to preserve and which to bury. She paused, dipped her pen again, and wrote on into the evening, while the wind scratched softly at the windows and the brass button gleamed faintly in the lamplight, quiet, polished, enduring. By the second Saturday of Advent, Lesser Whipple had adorned itself in the earnest clutter of the village Christmas season. Electric candles trembled bravely in stone-framed windows. The greengrocer had repurposed a stack of rutabagas into what he claimed was a nativity pyramid. And in the center of the square, a Christmas tree of enthusiastic height but patchy proportion stood proudly askew, its tinsel already listing to one side due to wind and the enthusiastic attentions of the vicar's terrier. Miss Catherine Moorcroft observed all this with a mixture of affection and something approaching disbelief. She stood in the porch of St. Stephen's that morning, wrapped in a sensible coat and holding a sheaf of programs for the upcoming carol service. The church smelled of cold stone and polish, and the choir was rehearsing in the nave with determined mediocrity. "You've been looking thoughtful," said the Reverend Strathmore, appearing at her side with the uncanny materialization peculiar to vicars and butlers. "I was wondering," she said, "how long it takes for a village to believe." "It has forgotten something." Strathmore adjusted his spectacles. "We tend not to forget here. We simply develop an agreed-upon silence." "That sounds more dangerous, perhaps, but also useful." He glanced at her. "Is it about that business in the field?" "Partly," she admitted. Strathmore sighed. "My dear Miss Moorcroft, the business of the past, like the business of God, proceeds whether we look at it or not. But you mustn't confuse remembering with carrying. I'm not sure I know how to separate the two." The vicar smiled. "Then perhaps you'll stay long enough to learn." She looked at him, startled. "You assumed I was going?" "No," he said gently. "But I assumed you were wondering if you ought." She didn't answer at once. The choir launched into a particularly limp rendition of "In the Bleak Midwinter." Mrs. Tilling, standing 4 feet away from the altos and singing with the enthusiasm of a drowning soprano, had evidently not received the memo about moderation. Miss Moorcroft winced. "I may stay," she said. "For now." Later that afternoon, she returned to her rooms to find another envelope, delivered by hand without address or stamp. Inside was a single sheet, folded neatly. "You were right to remember her. Truth has many authors, but not all of them know when to sign their names." A friend it was unsigned, but the hand was neat, upright, familiar in its restraint. Mr. Prewett. So, he lived. That night, she sat at her desk with the letter before her and her manuscript beside it. The essay had grown since she had begun it. No longer a neat compilation of notes, it had become something more reflective, more layered. A meditation, perhaps, something Lord Peter might even approve of. She was about to return to it when she heard a knock at the side door. This in itself was unusual. The front bell was for guests. The side entrance was for practicalities, grocers, deliveries, and the occasional child sent to borrow a hymn book. She opened it cautiously and was confronted by a familiar sight. A small boy in a cap too large. For his head, boots muddy to the ankle. "Alec Weston," she said. "Is it a bird?" He shook his head. "A box." He held up a square parcel, heavy and wrapped in brown paper, its string tied with purposeful care. "I found it on the stile. No name. Just return. Thought it might be important." She took it, nodded solemnly, and watched him disappear, again into the dusk. Inside, she placed the parcel on the desk, cut the string and unwrapped the paper. Within was a small wooden box. Inside that, documents, dozens of them. Letters, sketches, brittle maps, and several pages of notes in Marjorie Prewett's careful hand. Each item had been catalogued, numbered, preserved, and at the bottom, a single sheet in a different ink. "If the church does not wish to keep this, you must." What was hidden was not treasure but testimony. Let her speak at last. MP Catherine sat very still. The fire snapped gently in the hearth. Wind curled round the windows. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of the village church began a practice toll for evensong. She reached for her pen. Christmas arrived in Lesser Whipple with frost and overboiled sprouts. The carol service was a moderate success. Felicia Ardsmore wept openly at her own reading of "And the Glory of the Lord." The vicar, with an unusually broad interpretation of the lectionary, delivered a sermon that nodded discreetly toward resurrection, revelation, and the usefulness of archives. The choir, bolstered by a last-minute baritone from the next village, managed to conclude in harmony. Afterward, Miss Moorcroft stood by the tea urn distributing paper cups of something labelled mulled when she felt a presence beside her. "I read your piece," said the man. "The Diocesan Journal published it last week." She turned, surprised. It was the archivist from Shrewsbury, a tall, quiet man with a wool coat and ink-stained fingers. He had visited only once before during the official documentation of the Priory Chamber. He now held a small notebook and a cup of tea as if both might vanish. "I thought it was brave," he added. Catherine blinked. "I didn't mean to be." "No," he said, "that's why it was." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you plan to publish the rest?" She considered. "I plan to let Marjorie Prewett publish it. It's her work." He nodded. "She deserves—" Later that evening, as the crowds dispersed and the candles were snuffed out one by one, Catherine made her way once more to the Priory field. Snow had begun to fall, soft, hesitant, like a thought trying to form. She stood at the edge of the ruin, watching the white settle on the stone, the ropes, the gate. She thought of Marjorie, alone in her research, doubted by her brother, discarded by her neighbours, but persistent, unrelenting. Then she thought of Lovell Smythe, whose curiosity had outlived him, of Strickland, who had allowed fear to twist into violence, of Prewett, who had misunderstood love as silence, of Wimsey, who had seen it all and still offered gentleness, and of herself, an outsider once, now somehow rooted. She opened her notebook. Some stories do not end. They pause, shift, pass into other hands. What lies beneath the ground is not always lost, only waiting. And the truth, once spoken, echoes farther than we think. She closed it, tucked it away, and turned toward home. Behind her, the Priory waited. Beneath snow, beneath time, beneath the silence it had worn so long. And beside it, unseen but felt, the bees slept soundly in their hives, knowing what all good historians eventually learn, that not every winter buries, some prepare. The invitation arrived in March, written on thick cream paper, in a hand that was unmistakably educated and unnecessarily neat. "You are cordially invited to a private lecture hosted by the Shropshire Antiquarian Society at the Shrewsbury Assembly Hall, 6:30 p.m. Topic: Forgotten Foundations, the Haverley Priory and its Discontents, featuring Miss Catherine Moorcroft and selections from the unpublished papers of the late Marjorie Prewett. At the bottom, a postscript in a slanted hand, attendance not obligatory, interruption inevitable. PW it was, as she later told Felicia, both a trap and a tribute. She arrived at the hall in her best coat, clutching her notes and a small linen-bound folder of documents. The room was modest, 20 chairs, a lectern, and an audience of clergymen. Sceptical gentlemen in velvet waistcoats, one postmistress, and a boy with binoculars who may or may not have been permitted entry. The opening of her talk was steady, formal, outlining the rediscovery of the sealed chamber, the unusual circumstances of Lovell Smythe's death, and the subsequent investigations. But the room leaned forward when she reached the turning point. The letters from Marjorie, the maps preserved, the reluctant confessions of Mr. Pruett, and the final moment of vindication for a woman once dismissed as unstable. Miss Pruett, Catherine said quietly, was not seeking relics. She was seeking evidence, and in so doing she proved something we often forget, that truth does not always announce itself. Sometimes it has to be protected, even from those who love us. Silence followed. Then from the second row came the unmistakable drawl of Lord Peter Wimsey. "Bravo," he said, clapping once crisply. "If I may say, you've made a far better job of it than I would have." She smiled, bowed her head slightly, and stepped down. Afterwards, in the quiet of the cloakroom, Wimsey approached, gloved, hands folded behind his back, monocle polished to the point of menace. "I see you've become a detective after all," he said. "No," she replied, pinning her scarf, "only a reader who refused to stop reading." Which, if you ask me, is the same thing. They walked together out into the night. The air was brisk and full of stars, the scent of frost lingering on the wind. Outside, the boy with the binoculars was solemnly identifying street lamps as urban owls. Neither corrected him. At the edge of the square, Wimsey paused. "Tell me, Miss Moorcroft, now that the dust has settled, the papers are filed, and the ghosts appropriately footnoted, what will you do?" She looked up at him, her expression steady. "I'll continue," she said. "There are other stories like Marjorie's, and other truths left buried, not in ruins but in people." He nodded once, spoken like a true archaeologist of the human condition. Then he offered her something small, a brass B-shaped pin. "Had it made," he said lightly. "A reminder that some hives are worth tending." She took it without a word, pinning it to her lapel with care. They parted there, he to London, and she to the edge of a new chapter. Back in Lesser Whipple, the Priory field stood empty but not abandoned. The diocesan fence remained, but now with a placard. Historical site, under study. The chamber had been resealed respectfully, and its contents housed at the county archives, where a small exhibit now bore Marjorie Pruett's name. Mr. Strickland had been sentenced to 5 years, but would likely serve less. Letters of remorse were passed quietly from prison to parish. Lady Cattermole's legacy remained intact, though a modest sum had found its way into a bursary for local girls interested in history. Felicia's play was staged in Ludlow. It received 3.5 stars, and one reviewer described it as Agatha Christie if she had a cousin in the clergy and an axe to grind with the Domesday Book. As for Catherine, she stayed. She reorganized the church records. She taught Alec Weston how to catalogue specimens. She assisted in 2 more investigations, one involving a vanished marriage certificate and another a ghost bell that turned out to be a cow with a fondness for iron gates. But every so often, a new envelope would arrive from London. Sometimes it held clippings, sometimes inquiries, and once it held nothing but a pressed sprig of lavender and a card that read, "The Priory isn't finished with us yet, but we are, I think, ready for it now." The bees returned that spring. Their hives, undisturbed, thrived. Under a new keeper, a quiet man with a limp and a past no one in the village asked about too closely. He never spoke of his sister, but he always paused at the edge of the field as if listening, and though no one could say precisely what had changed, Lesser Whipple felt just a little more honest, a little less neat, as if, by telling the story, fully, and at last, the village had finally remembered how to breathe, and in that quiet, persistent way that truth sometimes has, things began, very gently, to grow.